Welcome to the Wall Street Lab podcast, where we interview top financial professionals and deconstruct their practices to give you an insider look into the world of finance. Here are your hosts, Lucas Muzialski and Leo Severino.
Welcome to episode number 9 of the Wall Street Lab podcast. We're really excited about this week's episode, and I'm sure that if you followed our updates on social media, I'm sure you'll be as well. As this week on the show, we had none other than the CEO of Barclays Germany and the head of banking for the DACH region, Alexander Dahl.
In our conversation with Mr. Dahl, we discuss a variety of topics, ranging from how he got his start in finance, down to the current M&A environment, as well as the investment banking industry in general. We also talk about the differences that he sees in his role as a CEO to his previous senior investment banking positions and how the way that he spends his time has changed. In the interview, Mr. Dahl gives us some very valuable insight into his work, which can really help those of you who still are wondering what it's really like to be a CEO of a large investment bank. If you enjoy the show, please make sure to leave us a glowing review on iTunes, as it helps us to grow the show immensely. You can also subscribe to our newsletter on our website, thewallstreetlab.com. And now, without further ado, please enjoy our interview with Alexander Dahl. Hello and welcome to the show. Today we're sitting here in Frankfurt at the offices of Barclays. We're joined here by Alexander Dahl. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
As for the usual, how we start these shows, we ask about how do people working in finance explain what they do to someone not working in finance. Let's say you are at a cocktail party or you are at a family gathering and a family member asks you, what is exactly that you do?
Well, the answer is pretty simple, as it should be. I'm providing financing. So if a corporate client, if a public sector client is in need of financing, the bank is the one who should be able to provide that financing. And of course, there are different advisory services bundled around the financing product.
Maybe as for some background to which is usually the preamble to these interviews, if we could go back to when you left high school, was finance on your mind straight away when you left high school and you thought about studying? Could you take us through this journey from where you've started and to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. Well, finance was not at all on my mind because I'm coming out of a family of scientists, biologists, so which is why I studied biology and philosophy, and only got accidentally into banking. And that's kind of a crazy story. I was working as a bellboy in a hotel in Berlin, actually. And one of the guests said to me, well, you obviously seem to get along well with people. So why don't you go into banking? So this is how it all came about.
I see. And what was the first step that you took towards your education, your first job, so to say, in finance?
Well, I then followed the traditional route, right? Studying business administration. I mastered with a master's degree and then started as a normal associate with the associate training program at Lehman Brothers in New York.
You've also held a few senior positions before joining Barclays. What was the journey from Lehman Brothers to the point where you are now? What happened in between?
Yeah, I think it's multidimensional. First of all, it's about getting the necessary knowledge, technical skills in order to be able to, advise a client on financing needs, right? Extrapolating models, etc. But then clearly, secondly, it's also about gaining seniority, gaining the breadth and the depth of really being able to advise a client. And advising is not only saying yes or you should do this, it's also about you should not do the other stuff. And that, of course, is related to your personal growth and your personal development. So therefore, it was really both hand in hand, technical expertise and growing from a personality side. And I think this is what this was all about.
Can you give us an idea of how your typical day currently looks like? Is there something like a typical day, or is it changing?
Well, I think it becomes dangerous if you don't remember what you have done at the same day or a day before. So my day is probably very much client focused. So I have many client meetings throughout the year. So probably a normal day is that I go straight to the airport. And as you know, Germany, the DACH region, is very decentralized. So traveling is a major part of my duties. And well, it's clients first. So I'm seeing clients, many client calls. And of course, at my job being the CEO here, there are obviously management responsibilities, talking to the internal clients, the internal team, talking to regulators and other stakeholders. So it's really a mix, but I would argue the majority of my time is really spent with clients.
Was this always the way it was in your previous role, or does it differ the way how you engage with clients the higher you are?
Yeah, I think, well, again, it's multidimensional. Well, the higher you grow, the more you're dealing with clients. That's for sure. So the less time you should, by definition, spend in the office. But then, of course, the world of banking has changed. Banking has become very much a regulated industry, which means your management duties, your duties towards the regulator and other stakeholders has increased. So there is the other dimension of spending more time with management and with the outside world.
Perfect. Let's switch up gears a little bit and talk a bit more about professional questions. Mm-hmm. How do you, from your standpoint, see the M&A market developing?
Yeah. First of all, there always have been differences in how corporates across the world have seen M&A. At the bottom or at the essence, M&A is a tool for corporate development. Now, I think you know where I'm trying to get at, is that the US domiciled companies have seen this much more as a tool for corporate development, whereas specifically in the German environment, it was less so. You know, that heavily used tool for corporate development. That has changed. It has changed dramatically because in many sectors we see lots of consolidation going on. Some people call it the end game, like the last big consolidation in some industries like chemicals, healthcare, etc. So therefore M&A has increased. It still comes and goes in waves. So M&A is correlated to financing possibilities, to GDP growth. So therefore it depends which time you're looking at, which sector you're looking at, and also which regions you look at, because M&A can be blocked. You can end up in joint venture situations only, something heavily used in Asia. So it really depends.
I see. So following up on this, I've heard your speech before at both Frankfurt School as well as the WHU University, the conference in WHU, and you were talking about the differences between the US and European investment banking environments. Could you comment a bit on that?
The product per se is obviously similar, right? As I mentioned at the beginning, it's all about financing and offering advice. So that is no different. I think the markets are different in a way how, well, the US is basically a single market, comparable in terms of the people who live there, but with no borders, right? Europe, despite the European Union, is still made up of national countries. So therefore, by definition, it's much more complex. Now, this has led to, well, a differentiation, whereas the US market is much more profitable than the European market. And therefore, if you, at least for a moment, assume the underlying cost base is similar, which it isn't, given the complexity, you have different patterns in both markets.
I see. Would you say that it's more difficult to operate within the European market?
Probably. And you also don't have that many market participants in the US, right? I mean, let's just look at some European banks who are not present in the US, whereas in Europe, everyone is present, right? Asian banks, European banks, American banks, Middle Eastern banks, etc. So Europe the market is much more competitive. And I believe that probably describes the heart of the issue. Plus, of course, with all the different countries and still somewhat different local requirements, yes, this also adds complexity.
When looking at a M&A deal opportunity, What are some of the most important aspects that you've learned from your practical experience matter?
Well, I mean, if I remember the good old days, then M&A was very much about bringing new ideas, combining information that the client might not have had. So we played like an information combining work here as a bank. And those deals tended to be very transformational. Now, I think the M&A product itself has developed into different areas here. I think for a banker, suggesting a deal or a client or a company that your client should buy, it's almost the hardest thing you can ever think about, because your client by now is at least one step ahead in terms of the industry understanding. So therefore, it's probably even more so than about the sector knowledge. Does it make sense, the strategic fit, etc. What I would care about, delivering content to the client. So at the end, it's a strategic discussion. So I care about the strategic fit. And coming back to my earlier point, not all deals will make strategic sense to the client. So I think this is the most important point. Financing, I think, is a secondary point, actually, because if something makes sense, then only you look into financing. So therefore, I think these are probably the two most important points. Thirdly, if you follow my argument that the world of banking tends to be much more regulated, commoditized, then you could see a trend as well where even M&A is just an outsourcing of internal functions of the corporates, i.e. an extended workbench, and not the old understanding of M&A bankers being rainmakers. It could well be that they are just an extended workbench where a company outsources the M&A execution role. So I think these are the 3 points.
I see. In one of our previous podcasts, it was the one with Simon Hurst. Simon mentioned that the industry experts are very praised within the investment banking area. And I think that point that you've made with the focus on the industry and the industry becoming more and more specific, it's important for investment banks to find industry experts. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Because if you buy into my argument that banking in itself is becoming a commoditized product, then you need to make sure that in a commoditized world, think about FX, trading volumes, the 5 largest banks account for 80% of the market. You need to be able to bundle products in order to retain your clients. And this can only be done by advisory. And advisory is best done if you understand your client, the sector, and can give advice there. I mean, commoditized products, on the other hand, are characterized by, the cheapest price, possibly, right? Which is different in the advisory world. So this is why then the sector and strategic content-driven dialogue becomes much more important than pricing, for instance.
You've been working in finance for a while. You've gained a lot of experience. What would you say changed the most since you've started until now?
I think it's definitely regulation. And regulation has an enormous impact on industries. Just think about the utility space, which is probably one of the sectors that saw heavy regulation in the first place. And that regulation has obviously an impact on the returns you can achieve, how you have to structure your industry, how you have to comply with regulation, which talent you can attract, how you can compensate people, and at the end, how you can further develop your company within that framework. So think back before there was any, not meaningful, but any large regulation. Capital had no costs. So basically banking was an industry that attracted the brightest talents, where you could be very creative in structuring new products. But of course, on the expense and at the expense of regulation and protecting market participants, which ultimately led to the financial crisis. So after the financial crisis, we are one of the most heavily regulated industries, which has impact on how you can retain talent, the brightest people, how you can compensate people, creativity, all the points I mentioned. So I would argue banking has become a much more normal industry, which I think is good, but then with different challenges ahead.
So we'll switch up gears a little bit again, and we'll jump into some personal questions and routines. We live in an era of information overload. How do you manage to keep the information that's coming to you relevant and shut everything else that's irrelevant out?
Well, you need to have your, strict order of how you deal with information. For instance, I'm pretty focused on the email, right? Because we are still heavy emails user and readers, etc. So I almost have an inner order in replying to emails. So my order clearly is clients first, then of course management duties and obligations, and this is how I structure how I manage my info flow. And I think you can become pretty good at it. To give you a number, I'm probably per day getting between 250, 300 emails, and I'm able to manage those. Of course, there's lots of information you don't need that sort of goes immediately somewhere else. But then all the relevant stuff, which is still pretty a lot, you need to cope with. And this is where, you cannot give a recipe how you do it. For instance, in my emails, I'm a good filer of emails, because I always want to be able to, go back what happens then. So I have, for instance, topic-related folders where I file my emails. I think this is pretty important, right? So this allows me that my inbox is not going from email number 1 to 2 years back, number 10,000, whatever, but I'm pretty good in filing those things as well. So there's almost like a Germanic filing system behind how I manage information by topic.
Do you have certain news outlets or sources that you follow?
Oh yeah, it's a lot. I mean, as a banker, you have many outlets, and it's almost, again, throughout the day. For instance, starting with some news apps, I'm still a reader of printed paper when I'm sitting in the plane, because then you have some spare time. There are other Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, other information sources that I read constantly and subscribe to.
Now, let's go back. Let's go back to the idea of graduating. And if you think back, can you think of 3 pieces of advice that you could give your younger self? Yeah. From your current standpoint?
Yes, and that's that's an excellent question. I think first of all, learning by doing is the most important point ever, right? Who has already reached a certain level, at a very young stage of his career, will never ever get to a more senior position, right? Because there is a certain desire of learning is involved in every job, and when you want to make a career. So that's the first point. The second point clearly is be straight, be direct, be yourself, right? There's no sense in playing games in not being yourself. We as human beings can only, change our personality within a certain framework. So therefore it's very, very important to stay oneself, or to sort of be yourself in a way, but then still be able to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. I think this is what I discovered. Many people are so afraid of making mistakes. I think it might sound like common knowledge to all of us here, but making mistakes is the most important point, because you don't learn from everything that works well. It's from the mistakes you learn well. And I am having a very, very close eye on the junior population, how they deal and cope with mistakes. So this is sort of my 3 pieces of advice. And then, of course, there is all the other topics like being a team player. Well, not everyone is a team player, right? And we need to have, in a diverse world, room for people who might be a bit different, right? So I wouldn't give the advice, be a team player, right? Be yourself and try to develop your skill set, but be able and learn from the mistakes you have made. This is the most important thing to me.
Talking about mistakes, do you have your favorite one when you go back?
My favorite mistake?
Your favorite mistake that you have learned from personally and that made you who you are?
There is a mistake, which is not listening, right? It's sort of wrapping almost your expectations into everything, or wrapping around your expectations around everything that the other party person you're talking to is saying. So therefore, listening, being open, and not just following your own mindset is the most important thing and the most done mistake at the same time.
Most of the people have a person who they've looked up to, who shaped their lives in some way. Yeah. Do you have a person like this?
Yes. Well, clearly my father, my mother. And then probably that person who told me, when I was a bellboy, you are good with people, so go to a bank. But then probably in my banking career, I used to work with David Freud, who is the grandson of Sigmund Freud. And that David Freud used to be columnist with the FT when he was in his early 30s. And then he joined Warburg and created the Business Service Transportation Leisure group, the sector group. And when I was at Warburg and then later UBS Warburg, I joined his team, and David was one of the greatest mentors, knowledgeable people, at the same time, fun person I've ever met. So he really shaped my life within the banking industry.
You mentioned he was a mentor to you, and this is a very important question to me, because I feel very strongly that the mentoring relationship is something that studying and learning by oneself cannot replace this sort of relationship. Yeah. Do you feel the same way? Or do you feel?
Agree. I fully agree. And well, unfortunately, you don't have that many mentors in your life, right? If you're lucky, you might have one or two real mentors. But it's very important to have those mentors. And I think it goes both ways. The mentors have a view and a feeling for what might be inside that person. And then, of course, you as the mentee need to be able to accept the feedback and the positive criticism you are getting, because you get lots of critics and criticism in your daily life. Many people, are very direct, but they don't want to do you any good. Then there's the other part who don't even tell you what they think, and you get it, around many corners. And then there are the mentors who really, really want you to develop and excel. And this is again what I said, being able to learn from mistakes, to able to listen. So therefore, I think a good mentor it's enormously important for a career.
You also talked about the importance of continuing your education. How do you feel about the MBA, CFA, Kaya, and other designations that people are taking, and the impact of these on the career of an individual?
Yeah, I think again there are some differences by geography, by region here. I think Germany just underwent this significant change in our whole educational system. So we are now comparable to we have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree. Well, I was one of the first ones, early movers, who, beside my diploma, Kaufmann, did go for an MBA in the States. So I'm, by definition, a big believer in an MBA. So I think that is important. At the moment, it's some people do it right after the bachelor's. I think the original idea was a bit different, have some time in between, etc. So I think that has to prove out. But in general, it's a very good thing, because you focus on other topics at a different career stage. So that is, I think, very, very important and helpful.
Outside of work, maybe you could share with us what takes the majority of your time.
Well, I'm a diver, so I'm a scuba diver. So whenever time allows, I'm doing some diving. So I did some deep drop diving. I did some cave diving. I'm a hiker in the Alps. I'm a biker as well. So there are many, many things. I go to, I'm very big into classical music, operas. And I do that with my wife. So I try to combine many things so I can spend as much time as possible with my wife and my son.
What is the best piece of advice you have ever received, and how did you come across it?
Well, the best piece of advice, I mean, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I have to say it's probably from a book, and it's a German poet by the name of Rainer Maria Rilke, who once said, and I tried to translate that one, it is important that you see your weaknesses as your strengths. Again, it sounds like a common knowledge, but if we have that attitude, that what you think makes you weak, maybe your sensitivity, or because you're a bit different, because you can work extremely well with numbers, then, well, there is something behind it that can turn this or can be seen as a strength. So it was from a book. And the more I think about it, the more I think this is there's lots of truths in it, because we as human beings are so obsessed with our weaknesses. But probably, as a matter of fact, our weaknesses many, many times can be our real strengths, actually.
Talking about books, one of the next questions refers to the idea of maybe implementing a policy. Let's just say that every employee at Barclays has to read one book recommended by you. What would that book be?
That's the most difficult question for today. I can give you my long list of 100 books that everyone has to read.
We'll be happy to post it in the show.
But it's really difficult to just point to one book. Quite frankly, honestly, I couldn't answer that question.
Okay.
Because again, it really depends on the person and on the situation. Mm-hmm. So this is why, very honestly, I think this is a question that should capture its all, but it doesn't.
Okay.
So this is why I have a long list of 100 books.
Do you have any daily routines or activities that you do that help you throughout your day?
Yes, there is. I mean, in the morning, I just get my espresso. Then I'm flicking through some of the news. So that clearly helps a bit of a calm moment in the morning, right, that you have to yourselves before it all starts. I do lots of sports. So sports for me is important to get that exercises. And then, of course, I like to unpredictable stop by at the desk of my people and have at least per day something unpredictable happening in my life.
What question would you ask in a job interview?
Well, again, there's a set of questions I'm asking, but probably the 2 or 3 most important questions are: what is it that makes you really drive, right? How you cope with mistakes you're making, and what is it that you want to achieve? And from that sort of mix, I can derive some interesting conclusions.
Now, here comes a question that I personally find really interesting. It's a question out of the Peter Thiel book, 0 to 1. What is something that you believe to be true that most people find completely not true?
Here I have 2 answers. One is the book that you asked originally, which probably is by Stephen Hawking. Mm-hmm. I forgot the English translation, but it's about is the universe, is it never ending? So that's his topic in that book. And I think that's probably a question as well, where most people probably not reach their limits, but it's pretty difficult for them to think about a never-ending, limitless universe, right? So this is something that I like to deal with those kind of questions, but you have totally different views. Might have to do with imagination. We are dealing with things, situations, lives that come to an end, and then there is the endless universe. How do you get that together?
It's really easy for me as well to justify eating a cookie when I think about the endless universe.
Yeah. But you know what? I mean, thinking about that question, it is important because it then also makes you understand, well, everything has its meaning, but in order to value that, there is a beginning, and for most cases, there is an ending as well, right?
That's a really interesting perspective. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you would like to leave our audience with?
Yes. Times always changed, right? And there is this Chinese saying that you never swim in the same river again. And accepting this wisdom that things change. If things change, most of the people have difficulties dealing with change. But change has a lot of positive things to it because we can change it for the better to start with. And times of change offer very, very excellent and great opportunities to impact those times of change. Now, we are living in times of change, as always. And I do believe if you, as the audience, if you keep your interest open, if you are continue to be curious, to learn, to develop, and to change things for the better, then I think this is all I like to leave with you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the interview. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
I'm delighted. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Wall Street Lab podcast. For the show notes and much more, visit us at www.thewallstreetlab.com. To see what we're up to before anyone else, subscribe to our newsletter on our website and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
The information contained in this podcast constitutes the opinions of individuals and should not be treated as investment, tax, financial, or legal advice. We take no responsibility for the accuracy of any statements made in this podcast. Any copying, distribution, or reproduction of this podcast without the permission of the creators of the podcast is strictly prohibited.